So what I'm going to do in the next 14 minutes is just talk a little bit about the Electoral Reform Act and how it got started. I was minding my own business one day when Occupy happened. And I was very interested to see the impact that Occupy had. It actually scared the living hell out of Wall Street and Michael Bloomberg. And it got America's attention. And so I was looking at Occupy and I suddenly saw there was an electoral reform working group within Occupy. So I got in touch with them and I said, hey, this is interesting to me. I'd never thought about electoral reform before. So I did some homework and I went up and I briefed Occupy for 6 minutes. That was my allowed time. And a guy named Philip Small videotaped me. And if you go to YouTube and you look up Steele Occupy Electoral Reform, you'll get right to a videotape that went viral. It got on the front page of Reddit, and I think it's been seen by over 100,000 people, maybe more, but it got multiple copies that were distributed. And what I realized in that moment was that electoral reform was the center of gravity, that all of our activist groups are fragmented. And I have in the second segment a handout, a review of a book by Micah Sifry on the big disconnect, why the internet hasn't fixed democracy yet, or politics yet. It's because everybody's fragmented. We're not able to come together. And I believe that electoral reform is the one issue where we can agree that we need a common change regardless of what we think about any given issue. I don't care what your position is on gun control or marriage or anything else. Electoral reform gives a voice to everybody, and let the process work once we restore an honest process, okay? So one of the things, I was interviewed by the Daily Bell, the libertarian rag, and they said, what's the difference between you and the other presidents? I said, A, I'm not trying to pretend I'm somebody else with every different group, and B, I'm not running to be president, I'm running to help you get back in charge. Put the public back into the public business, okay? So electoral reform for me is an existential campaign. It's not about electing a particular person, it's about restoring the democracy that we have a right to expect. So here I have a handout that's 2 pages, and I'm not going to spend any time on this other than to say these are the 11 electoral reform integrity principles. And these were created by some wonderful people, including Gail Work of San Mateo County and Eva Waskell, who was introduced to me by Gordon Cook. Now these are very straightforward. Transparency, a chain of custody on paper ballots that are counted publicly at the ballot site, not these debold machines that are crooked to the bone, and when they transmit their so-called electronic results from the local site to the advanced site, they're actually manipulated en route or they're ignored and new results are discovered on the other side. Observer access, checks and balances such as exit polls so that we have a double tally on how we think people voted. Enforcement of election laws, open ballot access, the right to use a paper ballot. One of the reasons people are moving toward mail ballots is because they're easier to manipulate. Okay, so we actually need to have public polling places where there are observers and ballots and every citizen does their duty. Okay, so mail ballots are a scam. The right to photograph and observe, the right to be educated about all assumptions that are being made about how things are done, and finally the right to review raw data. Okay, so these are just very basic. Princeton came out 2 weeks ago with a study concluding the United States of America is not a democracy. Okay, this is now official. We are not a democracy. We have a two-party tyranny that is owned by 42 billionaires. They are bought and paid for, the Congress, and that's what we need to change. Now, the second piece of paper that I have for you, which we'll discuss in the follow-on, is a one-page electoral reform summit concept. A piece of paper that I am not giving you is the budget for how I would spend $1 million in 2015. With workshops for all of the small parties and labor unions and other stakeholders all over, a bus that would go around with me and Richard Wolff, who wrote Occupy the Economy, and Eric Liu, whose YouTube I recommend. Eric Liu is a civics teacher who's done a 17-minute YouTube on what citizens need to understand about public power. It's one of the most sensational 17 minutes I've ever spent in my 63 years of life, okay? This guy is powerful. We have the power if we use it, but we're not using it right now, okay? And on this is a list of the people that I would invite to the Electoral Reform Summit. And it lists the attachments, and then it talks about the supporting initiative that is the open source activist toolkit. I believe we need two things in America right now to be victorious. One is an electoral reform summit that makes a non-negotiable demand for electoral reform in 2015 in time to elect an independent president with a coalition cabinet in 2016. I am not giving up on 2016. I think 2016 can be had in our favor. But if I fail in 2016, we can do it in 2020, but I don't believe we should wait till 2020. We should not waste 4 more years. And the second initiative is this open source activist toolkit. Because right now we are not sharing information, we are not coordinating wisely, we are literally a Tower of Babel. And so we are not coherent. Now here on this piece of paper, I have the 11 elements of electoral reform, and I want to stress that after I briefed Occupy, people came out of the woodwork from all over the country and got in touch with me. And so these 11 points are not my ideas. These are my best distillation of what I think everybody else has said. And the stakeholders that I have read about and consulted and heard from are listed at Big Bat USA. Under electoral reform, there's an entry called stakeholders, and you can go in and look at that. And those are the people that would be invited to receive a workshop. And I have a vision for a bus that goes across America for 2 months. What it's called, Chautauqua? Chautauqua bus, that has Eric Liu and Richard Wolff and myself telling this story at the same time that John Huntsman, Elizabeth Warren, or Dennis Kucinich, Gary Johnson, Jill Stein, if they agree to play, Jesse Ventura, Ralph Nader, Cynthia McKinney, they should all be saying, I will support electoral reform and I will support whoever runs for president, naming me part of their cabinet in advance. Now, there's actually a federal law that says you cannot promise a federal position to someone in advance of an election. The Electoral Reform Act would change that, and it would actually require that the coalition cabinet be appointed in advance, be party to creating a balanced budget in advance of Election Day. Therefore, we can challenge the Republicans and Democrats to do the same. They won't. And last but not least, we should have cabinet-level debates. So the competing attorneys general, the competing secretaries of state, the competing secretaries of agriculture, of education, should be required to have public debates in every state of the union. Okay? I want to work their ass to death.
So you want to shadow government in the parliament?
No. What I want to do is force the president to prove that he's capable of being president as a coalition president. I want to force the president to nominate a coalition cabinet which assures the public that we are not going to have a winner-take-all presidency. And at the same time, electoral reform makes it possible for a fraction of the Senate and the House to become independents and small parties. I had to run for president to find out that there are 8 accredited parties in the United States of America. Constitution, Green, Libertarian, Reform, those are the 4 active ones, and then there's Natural Law and Socialist, they're moribund. Working Families with Bill de Blasio and Justice with Rocky Anderson are emergent parties, but they're not accredited. The reason being accredited matters is because Congress has the power to pass a law that mandates that every one of the accredited parties putting forward a candidate for federal office must be on every state ballot for federal office. This law has been introduced to Congress 9 times, the last 4 by Ron Paul, and 9 times the two-party tyranny has refused to open ballot access to independents and the small parties. It is time to bury the two-party tyranny, in my humble opinion. So these are process, the electoral reform things, ballot access, voting for people. In other words, we need to change the way we vote, because right now this 51% majority is insanity. I absolutely agree with free and equal. We need to end the top two kind of concept. We need to go to instant runoffs where you can vote for 2 or 3 people, and then if your person doesn't win, then your votes roll over, okay?
You don't have a second choice.
That's your choice if you don't have a second choice, okay? We should be able to vote for issues. All legislation should be published in advance so that constituents have a chance to see it and instruct their representative on how to vote. There should be no secret legislation. There should be no secret laws. There should be no secret agreements. We should have these debates. The coalition cabinet is an essential part of assuring that we are electing a government of, by, and for we the people, not of, by, and for a party that's been bought and paid for by 42 billionaires, okay? And then in phase 2, which would be in time for 2018, phase 2, we would go to better open representation. I personally favor lowering the voting age. I'm not sure what it is state by state, but it ought to be at least 18. And it's possible we should be giving serious consideration to going down to 17 and even 16. But I would delay that until we had some educational initiatives that educated the young toward being more mature citizens. But I think the young people need to have a greater say in what we're electing. And I think we need younger people in government. Gerrymandering needs to be outlawed. The main reason I disagree with Lawrence Lessig and others who are focused on getting money out of government, out of elections, is because it doesn't matter. If gerrymandering remains, you are essentially giving people a lifetime contract for their elected position. So electoral reform has to be the whole enchilada, not just little pieces here and there. Funding has to be public funding. All qualified candidates should be funded by the public, and all airwaves that are public resources must allocate time for every candidate. We get rid of paying for television and radio. We make that part of the public access initiative. And I've mentioned election. Now, constitutional amendment, I've received some pushback on constitutional amendment. What I want to emphasize here is that a constitutional amendment is not my idea. It's the idea of a segment of the electoral reform community. It's possible that we do need a constitutional amendment. I don't know. But this is here out of respect for that group. Okay? So what we want to do with this electoral reform initiative is ensure that every part of America has a voice in creating this electoral reform summit, has a voice in creating what the legislation should look like finally. And last but not least, I will tell you, if I can find funders for these workshops to go to the different parties, the small parties and the Chautauqua bus, and if we can have a public electoral reform summit, and if we can get Occupy re-engaged, because the idea here is, among the documents I haven't given you are the statement of demand that the summit would release and the pledge that everyone would have to sign. We would have a summit in no later than June. We would demand that the legislation be passed by the 4th of July. And if they fail to pass it, we will occupy their front lawns and their home offices for the duration of the summer. And then we will return to battle in the fall. But they will see people on their front lawns and in their home offices for the entire summer. And we will be in their face all summer. I am absolutely convinced that for $1 million we can force this issue in 2015, in time for 2016. And I'm sorry that I don't have the personal charisma to raise the public without money. But unfortunately, in this country, you have to have some seed money in order to get things done.